This is my 52nd video on my work with OO Gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO Gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N-Gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO Gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N-Gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 26th dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby set track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby set track layout when I already had an OO Gauge layout using Bachmann Easy Track. This part covers my build of the Dapol, previously Airfix, Plastic General Store Kit C019. This is the kit as Dapol sell it now, in a bag stapled to a folded card. Convenient for shipping and okay for display, but not very kind to the potentially delicate parts. Here's my kit from the back. At least it doesn't appear to have suffered too much in transit. However, the plastic parts really didn't need transit to damage them, as they were essentially pre-damaged. The moulds for these kits are very old and clearly barely functional anymore, as the parts have large amounts of flash and other casting distortions. In addition to the plastic parts, the kit comes with a sheet of thin card parts for shop signs and window displays, a small sheet of clear acetate intended apparently to provide glazing for the main shop windows, and a sheet of folded assembly instructions, largely in the form of diagrams, but with some verbal clarification. Here are the plastic parts after I spent the best part of an hour trying to remove flash and other casting errors with a sharp knife and an emery board. The flash on some of these parts wasn't just the very thin stuff that you could almost brush off with your fingers. Some of this flash was so thick and sturdy that it was hard to tell where the flash ended and the actual part was supposed to begin. I did my best. To tell the truth, I didn't really pay much attention to the assembly instructions that came with this kit. It was pretty clear how the fairly straightforward parts were supposed to go together, and for my own reasons I didn't want to do the assembly in the order suggested by the instructions. The instructions, for example, suggested gluing all of the window frames into the walls first. I can certainly see that this would be the easiest time to glue the frames into the walls, but I wanted to keep parts that would have different finishes apart as long as possible in order to allow me to work on the finishes with whatever spray paint, brush paint, markers, washes, without having to worry about getting colour or wash on parts where I didn't want it. So I started by attaching the inside chimney halves to the end walls, as there was really no downside to this, and clearly the chimneys needed to be finished as a whole. There were just a couple of parts whose purpose I couldn't immediately identify, chiefly the two sort of long steppy-looking things which it turned out were supposed to glue to the sides of the main door opening between the shop windows in order to form the setback for the main door. Having figured out what they were, I glued these in place next. I did not glue the main door between them, as I wanted to paint it separately, but I did position the door between the pieces whilst the glue holding them in place set, as it would be critical that the door should fit exactly between the inside edges of these parts, and it would be easy for it not to so fit if they were glued on just a little differently. I did consider painting the walls before gluing them together, but I decided that I'd go the other way and glue the walls together before painting them. So first, two walls were glued together, trying to get as square and neat a corner as possible. A bit more filing of the parts happened here to try to improve the fit. Then the back wall was glued onto that assembly in the same way. Finally, the last end wall was glued in place. I used the lines on my cutting mat to square up the assembly as everything's set. I tried the roof parts on at this point just to see how they would fit. I didn't want to actually glue the roof in place at this point, as I needed to paint it separately. The main roof parts don't exactly fit together at the top. I realised that the long, thin part that came on the sprue with the drain pipes was actually designed to fit onto the ridge of the roof, in the gap between the main roof parts. I masked the inside of the main wall assembly so that I could spray paint it without getting overspray on the inside, where it would make attaching the window frames, etc. difficult. Then I took the wall assembly and the roof parts down for spraying. They'll come back a bit later after they dry. I painted the 2 doors blue, and when they were dry I did their knobs in gold for brass. Next I glazed all of the window frames and the doors. The sheet of glazing material that came with the kit was nowhere near big enough to do all of these and do the main shop windows, so I saved that sheet for the main shop windows and used other clear acetate that I had on hand to make glazing for these windows. I just put the window frames onto pieces of acetate, drew round the frame with a thin marker, and then cut out the acetate. Here are all of those glazing pieces glued into the backs of the frames and the doors, using polycement, which works okay for attaching acetate to styrene plastic. These pieces form the flat bases for the window displays. I finished their tops in a dark brown. And here are the roof parts and the wall assembly back from spraying. Brick red for the wall assembly and slate grey for the roof parts, at least that was the idea. I did my best to pick out the sills with a black marker. I applied a black wash to the roof parts, a dab of black acrylic paint thinned in IPA and washed over with a broad brush. Then I applied a grey wash to the walls to hopefully tone down the red and vary it a bit to create something more realistic. Here are the walls after that wash dried. Definitely not perfect, but on the other hand certainly an improvement over the plain red. At this point I glued the window frames in place in their gaps in the walls. I decided that I could live with the window frames just being the light grey they came as, so I was lazy and didn't paint them. If I had been going to paint them, I would have done it before attaching the glazing to them. It was certainly a bit more fiddly gluing the window frames in place like this than it would have been to do them at first, as the instructions said, but it wasn't that hard, and this way certainly suited me better. These are the downpipes, for downspouts for the guttering, still attached to the sprue they came on. I painted them with Tamiya gunmetal paint and stuck them like this to dry. I glued the bases for the window displays in place under the main shop window openings. This was certainly a bit fiddly, because it's a bit hard, trying to get inside the assembly to do it. I basically put a bead of poly cement along where the base fitted under the window, pushed the base into place with the assembly held in mid-air, and then quickly put the assembly down on a flat surface and manoeuvred the part to be neatly and centrally placed before the glue started to set. Next I cut glazing pieces for the main shop windows from the sheet that came with the kit, and glued them in place. I made the pieces as large as would fit against the wall between the other parts, in order to make it as easy as possible to glue them in place without getting glue on the actual windows. Here's the front of the building at this point. This is the sheet of thin card parts for signs and window displays that came with the kit. I wasn't very happy with these options. Neither of the possible shops seemed very appropriate for my place and period, and in any case they weren't all that well done, so I cast about to make my own signs and displays. I settled on a couple of possible options, either a tobacconist or an ironmonger. I created my versions by scanning the sheet that came with the kit at 600 dpi, which is the maximum resolution of my printer. Then I fitted suitable images over the originals in the scanned version, and then printed the results out on my printer at 600 dpi. I separated the set out into 2 sections in order to have all of the images upright, which was less confusing than having some of them sideways as on the original sheet. The original sheet was also not printed square on its piece of card, so I trimmed the edges to make it square to the image before scanning it. I had printed my images on paper as I didn't have printable cardstock on hand, so I glued them to pieces of card before cutting them out. I decided to go with the ironmongers as those images seemed to present better in the small scale. These are the ironmongers' window displays cut out. I scored the fold lines on the back of the card before cutting these pieces out. I decided that I'd better glue the doors in place before fitting the window displays, as having the window displays in place was likely to make the building more delicate to handle. Here's the front door in place. And here's the back door, slightly out of focus for some reason. The autofocus on my camera has a mind of its own, and there is no manual focus. With the doors done, I folded the window displays ready to fit them. The card pieces for the window displays were glued to the edges of the display bases using rocket card glue, rather a fiddly process. I cut out the main Ironmonger shop sign and coloured its edges with a blue marker, as this seemed to best match the sign content. Then I glued that sign over the shop front using rocket card glue. Now it was time to fit the roof. I had to scrape paint off the tops of the walls, as I hadn't masked those, and polycement only works if it's contacting actual plastic. I stuck the roof pieces in place, trying to fit them neatly around the chimneys and pushing them down firmly onto the tops of the walls until the glue set. Then the long, thin piece was glued in between the tops of the two pieces along the ridge. I'd coloured the top of this piece with a black marker earlier. Finally, the downspouts were glued in place. Since these had sort of pins on their sides at the top and bottom, I expected there to be holes in the walls into which those pins would fit, which is the normal sort of Airfix arrangement. But there were no holes, so I just superglued the sides of the pins to the ends of the walls. And here is the building on the layout, along from the railway station building. I think this is where I'll keep it, although it could go on the other side of the station. Here's a view from the other side. And here's a general view over the layout at this point. I have a super quick Greystones farmhouse kit, which is destined to go on the other side of the railway station building, all being well. After viewing those last few pictures, it rather annoyed me that the light grey underside of the roof parts was showing at the end. It wasn't really noticeable in natural light, but the flash picked it up in photos, so I took the building back to the bench and carefully painted under the ends of the roof parts with the darkest grey brush paint that I had. It's not a big difference, but I do think that's a bit better. I could probably fiddle endlessly trying to make things a bit better, but I might end up making them worse. I think that'll do for now.